right.
There we go.
All right. Fingers crossed for no dropped frames. All right. I don't even know what episode we are.
So 30
37, I believe it is. I believe it's 37. Modem Futura, episode 37.
Possibly.
Or something. Let me slide that over there. Get my coffee out of the way. Yeah, okay, wow. Episode 30. Wow, it is. I wrote it down. It's episode 37.
Goodness me. Yes.
My goodness.
Quite incredible. Yes.
That's fantastic. Yeah, well, I think one thing. So, Andrew, first of all, again, welcome to those who are joining us in Spatial Video. I just have to say, I love that we are continuing to push the spatial stuff. So it's a lot of fun. We don't just talk the future, we do
That's
the future. Right. We're pushing the boundaries, which I think is really fun. And again, well, I should say it this way. One, I really enjoy watching. So, I mean, it's no surprise. If anybody out there who's ever filmed something, recorded something, you end up living that recording over and over and over again. But I will say, watching back, playing the videos in Spatial it's quite fun.
I agree. Because it does feel like you're sitting at the table.
It does.
Yes.
It does. It really does. It feels like you're sitting at the table. It feels like you're in the room. You can feel some of I mean, that's the whole point of it, right? It provides this spatial sort of aesthetic or this experience, so you can feel the differences between. We're just not just a flat.
And so one of these days, I think we keep promising this. We're going to have an episode on the Apple Vision Pro because it has been trashed so much recently with people saying that there's just no market, nobody's using it. Actually, it's wrong. I mean, we're both using it. We're both loving using it. I tap into communities where people are really excited about using it every day.
Absolutely. I think, and I think it's warranted. I think there has been, when we get to that, we'll do a specific episode on that. But because I think there's also some pretty high profile examples that I thought were quite nice. So Adam Savage from the Tested, former Mythbusters universe kind of guy. So they did a 1 year after the launch sort of video. And I thought that was really good. And we can do our own version of that because it'll be different because their use case I think is quite a bit different. But I think the same sort of message will come through to that, which is these devices, while not for everybody and very expensive, also are very cool and as a technological showcase of future capabilities, tremendous. And that's what's really exciting about doing some of this work in Spatial is I think we're...
And we should say for all of those people that don't use the Apple Vision Pro, we're experimenting with recording in Spatial Video, which means when you put the headset on, it feels like you're in the room with us.
That's right. It's this 3D effect. And it's like, I tried to explain it one day. What were those old, what was it called? A Viewmaster?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right? The old, we had like that wheel.
I used to lust after them as a kid.
Well, my kids, I did the same.
Yes.
And my kids have one, and I think it has like images from like the National History Museum, so there's like dinosaurs and whatever. And like even today with the advancements of like Oculus VR headsets and Vision, like the stereo vision you get from those like Viewmaster things is still really compelling.
I know.
But essentially that's how I explained it because somebody was like, what is this Spatial? What does it feel like? And I'm like, think of it as the Viewmaster where you have this 3-dimensional still image for stills. Where as you move, the parallax follows and you can it mimics essentially, I promise not to get too technical into it already, but it mimics essentially the interocular distance between human eyes to give that 3-dimensional quality. But then now add that in moving motion of a video, which is really compelling, which is not the same as 3D.
It's not fully immersive yet, which is another level, which we would love to get to.
That's what we need that Blackmagic camera for.
That's right. But it feels really intimate. I mean, if you haven't experienced a podcast recording in Spatial Video, it is just something else. Which is where we're sort of trying to go for this with experimentation.
Absolutely. And I remember early on, because before I had spatial ability on my iPhone before I had a headset. But I would still from time to time switch over to Spatial, just going, I'm not exactly sure what the benefit's going to be yet. But I will say too, and so I had heard this from someone else, a different podcast, they were talking about it. But when you see, for example, a spatial photograph that you've taken of like a family member or a pet or something that's dear to you, when you see that back in that sort of 3-dimensional spatial display, it is like, I mean, it's incredibly it's powerful.
It is. And I would go one step further than that. And I hadn't realized this till I was showing my wife some of this stuff. The fact that I can go somewhere and experience something and take these spatial videos and photos, and then she can experience it through my eyes, having never been there.
Yeah. And it's been fun. I mean, even just you and I, we go like
you send stuff from Lisbon.
Yeah, you go on a trip and you're like, you take a panorama.
Right. Yes.
And again, you can experience panoramas in many ways, but again, in one of these headsets, to be able, especially when you do the full panoramic view, you can feel like you're actually you get this sense of what it's like to actually be standing in that location.
Right. Yes.
Which is incredibly cool. And again, as a photographer going back, decades, it's a really cool new way of exploring that medium to, again, create affect. What are we doing with it? So it's a lot of fun. So
but anyway, this is a nice segue into our conversation today, which is all about emerging tech.
Yes, big time emerging tech. And this is an episode we've been chomping at the bit to do for quite a while, because this is a big one.
The embargo is now lifted.
This is a big one. So I'll set up a teaser and we'll cut for a break, and then we'll actually come back and get to it. So what we're talking about is I would say a pinnacle publication that people who are into technologies, futures, that we kind of wait for every year. Right. Is this? It always comes in the northern hemisphere. It's always summertime, but it's the World Economics Top 10 Emerging Technologies.
World Economic Forum.
Yes, World Economic Forum. Thank you. Top 10 Emerging Technologies of 2025.
Yes.
So we'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, let's get into it, because there's a lot to explore.
Yep.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura. I don't know. I still laugh every time we take a break. I cannot help when it's like time to get back into it.
It's a nervous laugh.
I love it. Oh, but it's a giddy laughter. I love it. So as we, I suppose we'll kick off the show formally. So Sean Leahy here, joined by my amazing colleague
Andrew Maynard,
and that means this is Modem Futura, the show that explores the intersection of technology, society, and the possible, probable, and preferable futures, asking deep questions like what will it mean to be human in the future. And I can think of no better ways of exploring that intersection of technology society than digging into these top 10 emerging technologies of 2025.
Yes. Yep.
So I think what we might do, Andrew, if I can kind of put you on the spot a little bit, because you have been working with the World Economic Forum for quite some time.
Since the beginning of these, back in 2012.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the World Economic Forum is much more than just this
This is just a little bit of WEF, but it's an important piece.
Yeah, it's one of what they do.
Yeah.
And so if I could too, I would like to put you on the spot a little bit just to get some insights into what it's been like for you, how you came to be, included in part of the World Economic Forum, but also perhaps for people who are listening to our show who may not know what even the World Economic Forum is.
Yeah.
I mean, I had talked about it a little bit when I came back from Geneva, that I had the just a wonderful opportunity to actually visit the main headquarters there in Geneva, which was a fantastic experience.
Yeah. Goodness me. Yeah. So let me see whether I can do this really, really quickly.
Okay. I do have dates if we need them. Okay. I wrote down some dates.
We'll see.
Okay.
So I think for most people, the World Economic Forum is synonymous with their annual meeting in Davos, which is in January every year. And it's notable because around about 2,000 of the world's top leaders and thinkers and movers and shakers get together in this small alpine town of Davos. And they spend a few days in meetings, supposedly sort of putting the worlds to right and working out sort of how they are part of building a better future. And it usually gets an awful lot of flack. You hear about things like Davos mad and people rolling their eyes at it. And I would say, having been a couple of times, nothing that you read in the media is actually true when it comes to the true nature of the meeting. But this is what people know for. But the organization is much, much bigger than this. It started out as was an organization that just convened meetings of people who were trying to understand how to move the world towards a better place, primarily through economic means, but also much broader than that. So it's always been an organization that has excelled in bringing together people and organizations that have this ability to be movers and shakers. And I would say that out of all the organizations I've worked with, they are the slickest when it comes to actually convening meetings. But you go back a couple of decades or so, and the organization realized that they didn't just want to be bringing people together. They actually wanted to be setting agendas. They wanted to have some sense of big thinking about where the world is going, where the opportunities are, where the challenges are, and how you actually empower and enable people to build the sort of future you want. So that goes back, and this is probably in your dates. I think it was around about 2008. They started what they referred to as the biggest brainstorm in the world. And these originally were called the Global Agenda Councils. We met for the first time in Dubai. Was it 2008 on your list, or 2007? It was somewhere around there.
Yeah, I don't have that exact spot. But
anyway, so I was part of that initial wave of those meetings, and they were quite incredible. So this gives you an insight into this. You had about 800 people getting together, experts from across the world in many, many different areas, to sit down for 2 or 3 days and really grapple with how their expertise comes to bear on some of the biggest challenges in the world. And that usually spun off into a number of initiatives and programs and things. And one of those programs, after a few years of doing this, was looking at this list of top 10 emerging technologies. So this came out of the what was then the Global Agenda Council on Emerging Technologies back in 2012. And as part of that council, we were sitting together thinking about how do you help people understand just how transformative some of these emerging technologies are? Not necessarily the big ones, just like AI or biotechnology, but the very specifics.
The sexiest buzzword,
that's right. But the things that are emerging that are likely to have a profound impact over the next sort of 5 or 10 years. So these are not just speculative ideas. People are actually working on them, building companies around them. And the idea was very simple. Why don't we have a list that attunes people to what's coming along so that they can fold those into their decision making, whether they're CEOs, business leaders, policymakers, or just members of the public who want to know what's going on? And so that's where the first list was born. And it was literally a bunch of us sitting around saying, if we created a list, what would we put on it?
What do we do with this?
And it was actually quite radical, because at the time, the World Economic Forum was primarily focused on global economics. Emerging technologies wasn't really a big part of their agenda. And yet, when this list came out and we had a piece in the Washington Post, it almost broke the forum's internet. It was the most accessed item that they'd ever seen. And it was part of the forum's realization that if they wanted to have global impact over a long period of time, they needed to take emerging technology seriously. And that eventually led into Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum's thinking and book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So this was part of the progression toward that. But so from that early meeting, sort of back in 2012, every year, I mean, the list and the methodology have evolved over time. But again, the forum has realized how important it is to not only have this perspective on what's coming along that has the potential to change things, but also build a robust methodology underneath that. So it's not just some random list. Yeah, no, it's incredible too. I mean, that's, I still remember. So when I was looking this up, I didn't realize that it was founded in early 70s. Like originally, like the World Economic Forum. Yes. By, as you mentioned, by Klaus Schwab. And then, as it has sort of grown over like the decades. Because I think did he recently step down? He's I mean, it's after 50 some years. It's been a little phase, but now he's effectively handed over the reins of the organization. But his stamp, his philosophy, his ideologies are still very much there. Well, and for me personally, I mean, as a futures scholar, I mean, his work. So going back, if I trace my sort of interest in this whole sphere of work, it came from like, you would hear World Economic Forum, you'd hear WEF here and there, you'd hear the term Davos being kicked around. But even if you're not in that space, these are just sort of terms and things that are kind of floating in the background. But for me, it was the sort of that transition to this fourth industrial revolution that really was like, wait a minute,
what is this? What are we talking about here? And then all the light bulbs had gone off. And that was one of the things that had really drawn me in to futures in the first place was, having always been someone who has been hungry and pushing on the emerging technology side of things, it was then, it's sort of like that epiphany when you're like, wait a minute, there's a bigger world here.
Right.
You know? And that was, for me, that was one of these pieces that brought in. And then, of course, then you sit and then watching these things year after year and different things, right? I mean, one of the things I think is really important for people who are listening, who may if this is your first sort of exposure to the World Economic Forum, is also understanding, I mean, what they have done over those 50 some odd years around this idea of like embedding long-term social and environmental responsibility, right? So taking this stance, which for me, again, I came to it through Klaus Schwab's, I think it was with his, I don't know if it was the first or the second book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but really it was making these statements that we resonate so strongly with in terms of like the academic discipline of future studies, is all of these things that you hear us talking and resonating with these exact principles of who is gained, who's disadvantaged, what is happening. How do we ensure that through all these innovations and emerging technologies and disruptions, that we benefit as a human society?
That is so important. I think that's what gets missed. The driver of all of this is asking, how do we ensure human flourishing? How do we not just look at the flow of money and the flow of goods, but how do we look at society and individuals and how to empower them within this broad global economic system?
Yeah. And I think I would argue too, because, you hear, again, going back to the Davos, man,
Right.
I mean, it is.
And there are a lot of women. See, this is what annoys me about it, because there are a lot of women at Davos.
But you can understand. So if you're on the outside, it is an exclusive convening. And of course, who is there, right? These are top executives, policymakers. These are big name people. So from the outside, you could understand there'd be some like, wait a minute, this isn't not just everybody can come.
Yeah.
But part of that, right, is that these people who are there tend to be highly influential or powerful in terms of things that they can enact. But that's, I think, part of what is that the World Economic Forum is sort of known for, is this high trust convening, not just convening, but this high trust. Bringing the, business, government, civil, academia, youth together in these meetings.
And can I just say that the youth bit here is crazy important. So yes, you think about it being these just sort of business leaders. The first time I went to Davos, one of the people that I got to know well there was a YouTuber.
Oh, interesting.
Sean Ahmed. And his only claim to fame was that he made YouTube videos. And it was fantastic being with him there.
How about somebody who makes podcasts, I think?
Well, that was a long time ago now. He's moved on from there. But very influential in my thinking. And then sort of the other thing that struck me every time I've been is, certainly when I was there, one of the last panels of the meeting was a panel with a couple of very influential people and a panel of youth leaders. And these were usually sort of people between sort of 17 and 19, 20.
Yeah.
And the sort of people that obviously weren't CEOs. They weren't sort of startup moguls or anything. They were just young people that had a clear vision of what they would like the world to be like, what they would like the future to be like. And those shook me to my core every time I watched them. One of the meetings there, we'll get to the emerging technology in a minute, was I remember a panel with Christine Lagarde there and these sort of four young people, and she was in tears.
Interesting. Wow.
And it's that sort of experience. I mean, everybody has their own Davos stories, but it's that sort of experience that makes you think this is not just about the rich and famous getting together. This is about truly seeing how we change the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's so powerful. And again, while our focus today is going to be around these top 10, once I let us get to it, right? That's the art. We're building suspense, right? I had to wait a year, since the last one. But I think that's another piece. And I would heavily encourage people to go look and browse around the World Economic Forum to learn, what their interest, because another time we can also get into some of the crazy cool futures tools that they offer, which are incredibly valuable for anybody who is in the futures space, is to think about how you can leverage these tools that are made available. But also because part of that is this idea too of creating action platforms, right? So it's not just the talk. It's how do you take that talk, that dialogue, and convert it into collective projects.
Right.
So supporting, climate resilience, health, security, digital trust, the list goes on and on and on. but be able to create these thematic centers that really try to create a platform for, it's not just meeting, it's not just wealthy people talking about,
it's doing as well.
It's how do you, and that's the critical piece. So even again, when we think about futures work, it's fine to talk about it, but at some point you have to start putting operational plans or strategic ideas where it's like, what do we do today? Like, what do we do today? What do we do tomorrow? What do we do after that? And
of course, this is actually a great segue to the list, because one of the things that differentiates the list is this is not just sort of speculative, fancy technologies. Every single technology on there, we have to see evidence that this is moving from an idea or a lab into commercial reality.
Right.
So yes, we're trying to look over the horizon, but we're doing it very, very practically.
Yeah, and I think should we start?
Yes,
we start. Okay. So we're going to start. So what we're doing is we'll go, and I do have I want to talk. Can I set up the methodology?
Yes.
First. Okay.
Yes.
So what we're looking at. So this is freely available. You can get it's the from the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the World Economic Forum, Top 10 Emerging Technologies of 2025, the flagship report, June 2025.
Yes. Released today, if you're listening to this podcast.
Brand, it's hot off the presses.
Right.
I think it's like, it has that smell.
Yeah, right.
You remember when things used to have smell when you could pick up paper?
Yeah, you could just imagine it. Yes.
Yeah. Or if you're old enough and you remember those like mimeograph things from like elementary.
Oh, goodness me.
And you'd get that blue purple thing and smell it right away because it had a lovely tingle in your nose.
We should probably stop that conversation there.
6-year-old Sean smelling the paper. Right. Can't ready to dive. But so one of the things, again, coming to this is, and I think, Andrew, you were starting to hit on some of the differences between, because in today's landscape, there is, I would say, perhaps no shortage or no lack of, organizations, new or old, throwing out their top 10, their top 25, their top whatever.
Yes.
And so while there is a sort of a wealth of those types of lists and things that in publications and reports that people are putting out, from my perspective, one of the things that sets the World Economic Forum, this particular report, apart from that is some of the things we touched on, right? Again, that trusted expertise, bringing these people together. But also what I really appreciated too was right off the bat in the report was the nod to the methodology. Because if you take a quick scan and someone else will do like a fast rundown and just list the top, the top 10 items, you will notice you're like, hey, where's artificial intelligence?
Right. Yes.
Where's agentic AI? Where's artificial general intelligence? Where are all the buzzwords? Right. Where have they gone? Right. And I think one of the pieces to this that one is so refreshing is also to that note, right, is what technologies are chosen and how they're chosen, but also what you can see. And I'll kind of walk through, I took some notes and I'm going to touch on some highlights here, because what it does is it demonstrates that care of how this, now I will say historic because it's over 50 years, a historic organization and trusted organization continues to preserve and strengthen that trust by being transparent about why it's choosing, how it's done it, and why the reader should take care to note these reasons for what happens next. Because I think that's another piece that they do really well is they say, we're presenting this information, but also giving this to you with some context of how to springboard from this from a futures perspective. So what do you do with this information? They even give you some starting ideas of how you might use, regardless of what your personal or professional context is, whether you're in private business, whether you're in education or healthcare, how can you start thinking about what to do with the report that's done here? And so, because I'm curious, right? So as someone who's not involved in the process, I'm like, well, how do they get, because I'm like, again, you look at this list and you're like, I don't see any of the buzzwords, right?
Where the heck does this come from? Yeah.
But essentially, I mean, so just real quickly, the methodology, so the way that the report is structured is that they first field all of these nominations, right? So it goes out to all of their networks via a survey mechanism to say, well, what do you think, Andrew?
We have a lot of stuff coming.
And there's a lot of people in these networks and asking, from, again, across those business, government, academia, whatever. What do you think are these emerging things, right? So these massive things come in. So, and it's clear also, I think worth pointing out that which I think is helpful, especially for people who are new to this type of report, to futures work, is also defining what is meant by emerging technology.
Right, yes.
Right? Because that's a term that can be loosely applied.
Yes.
But essentially, so in this report, the definition here is that it encompasses both entirely novel innovations, so things that these are brand new things that have not existed before, and the established technologies, so things that have existed before, being applied in transformative new ways. So things, and I think one of them is a real ringer for that one. But this idea that something that is emerging is not always just that it now didn't exist and now it is, but also something that is, we've discovered a new way of using something that was built 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, 6 months ago, but we're using it in a completely new, innovative way that gives rise to a whole new way of thinking and potentially even new industries in that sense, right?
Yes, yeah.
And that's, I'll just say a little bit about that in the sense that with the fourth industrial revolution, that spawns you to go a deep dive into that. That's part of that, is that these new innovations, new disruptions, and new convergences of different technologies and spaces are creating not only new things, but entire new industries.
And that is really important because it's so easy to get caught up in the big buzzwords, but true innovation happens in the interstitial spaces. And usually a really transformative innovation doesn't necessarily have a neat name to it. It's just something that people are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a mistake that is often made is that when people are thinking about future technologies and emerging technologies, they're thinking about those buzzwords.
That's right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And the challenge, and people, if you ask like people who are, quantitative futurists who are really in the weeds of this stuff, they're scouring, patents. And these are small things usually. And this is, again, we'll save the long bit here, but this is where we get back to this idea of what's a signal, what's a trend, and what's a driving force. But looking for these little signals. Oh, someone made this thing. Oh, that's interesting. By itself? Okay. But then you start seeing how these things together, you're like, that opens up this whole new thing.
And so you actually see that in the process. So yes, you sort of started off with the big funnel, and then it gets down to the team of us that actually sort of sift through these. And with everyone that comes in, in fact, we sort of have a pre-filter where we sort of have a top sort of 20 or so that we look at. But each one, there's this test and this discussion around, is this truly emerging? Sort of, what is the evidence that this is more than something happening in a lab or a good idea, and that people are actually beginning to move towards commercialization? What is the evidence that this is truly going to have impact over the next few years rather than being some 50, 100 years in the future? So we test every single one of these. And it's fascinating being in these meetings. I mean, it's eye-opening as we begin to sort of push and pull against these.
Because it is. The note I had here too is they go from basically 250 of these suggestions down to 20. And then from there sort of go through that final grind of like cage match.
And then the really fun part of this is you'll find as you go through this grind, somebody says, why haven't we got X on the list? And so you had that sort of final thing where we suddenly realize, actually, even with this sort of funnel process, maybe there's something that's been missed. And then that becomes sort of in play with the conversation.
And I thought it was interesting too that in this report, they make a special sort of call out to using this tool created by a unit called Frontiers called the AI Trend Analyzer, which essentially was not meant to make a decision on these things, but it was mapping these big, this big list of 250 things, mapping those across concepts matched with frequency across 10-year lifespan. So looking at things that not only are now, but also can you sort of track the origins of where these ideas came from initial thoughts or papers or patents or whatever. And I thought that was a really interesting, and also, talk about an example of a very compelling way of leveraging one of these AI tools to assist the human experts in going, well, how, because that would take, this would slow down from a yearly process to every decade we do it. But no, so that's incredibly cool. And I will, I'll try to keep this part brief because I get excited about the methodology, which I know I don't want to turn people off because I'm like,
I can see every minute we go along, we're losing listeners. So when we finally get to the list, those 10 listeners who are left.
I gotta build suspense to allow me to geek out and go all nerd storm on the methodology.
But it is really important because that's what gives us the credibility.
And I talk a lot in other spaces too about different types of learning styles and So one of the things I think is really interesting that they have done with this, this report as well, is there's defined this ecosystem readiness. And this is new, right? I don't remember this before.
It shifts every year. So the methodology sort of is
growing,
more robust, and it grows every year. Yes.
So along with each 10, and so the reason I mention this, because when you go to view it, and we, depending on how long we have, because this could be a 10-hour episode. I think we've got 13 hours on the deck we can record. So but with each of the 10 items, there essentially is applied a readiness, I don't want to call it a score, but essentially a graph.
Assessment.
Yeah. And so if you think about it like this, that this ecosystem readiness is that the technology is mapped across 5 sort of key dimensions. This is a common thing. It's known as STEEP, which stands for social. I had to write this down. I couldn't memorize this one. I know it, but I have to write it down every time. It's social, technological, environmental, economic, and policy. So it creates, essentially, if you think about this like 5-pointed star diagram.
Like a spider map sort of thing. Yeah. Spider's web map, yes.
Yeah, that has 5 distinct points on it. And each one of those endpoints is one of those pieces. And so visually, when you look at this technology, you can also see where does this technology sort of fit across those key dimensions in terms of its readiness, its potential impact, and things like that. And then the last thing I'll kind of mention before we get into the actual list is again, because I think this is part of the power of this report, aside from just the actual naming the technologies, is it provides with each one the strategic outlook.
Yes.
Right? So again, it's not just, here it is. We've done the methodology and we've shown it to you. It's a short section. Is it always done by the Dubai Future Foundation, or is that just for this year?
This is a partnership which is developing, but it gives this really interesting perspective.
Yep. And so what's nice about that, again, coming from a futures perspective, is you have a very sort of well thought out sort of futures perspective of, again, what do you do with this information around this technology?
And this is important because imagine that you put this report in front of folks in the C-suite of a large corporation. If it was just a list of top 10 emerging technologies, it would mean nothing. The fact is that this is actionable. This has got relevant information, whether you're in the C-suite, whether you're making policy, whether you're a policy analyst,
it's huge.
Whatever.
Yes. And that's huge, because that becomes a part of so that answers, or at least tries to help provide a way of investigating the so what.
Yes.
Technology number 1, this is a so what.
Right.
That's what this is. What does this mean for you? Is this something is this an opportunity? Is it a threat?
That's it. Yes. Yep.
How would this develop? And this is what we do all the time in the future space, right? Is if this is a change that's coming, or an innovation or disruption, how is your organization, whatever, how are you going to respond to this?
Yep.
And what are those multiple order of impacts or the unintended consequences? I mean, it's really fertile ground for just running with these ideas and going from there. So, okay, so that's the setup.
Are we actually going to get to this list?
I don't know. I feel this power of I can hold it off and build suspense. But Andrew, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
How do you want to do this? Should we just go in order? Or
I think we should at least mention all of the 10. I'm not sure we want to do a deep dive into every one. And so maybe we can sort of pick things that really sort of stand out to you. But we ought to sort of briefly go through those top 10 and say a couple of things about each.
Sure. So maybe, I think there's a couple that I think I'm more.
Yeah.
I mean, I have my own biases of the things that I'm like, woo, tell me more about this.
But it's interesting going through. So every year we do this, there are things on this list where people say, why on earth did you put that on? Because it wasn't on my radar. It doesn't look like an emerging technology. And I'm glad you went through the methodology, because it shows why we did. But there are always things that are surprising. Yeah. So actually, if I'm going to sort of jump straight
you want to give the first one? Sure.
So the first one on the list.
I was surprised by this as well.
Yeah. It's structural battery composites.
I'm like, why? What is emerging about this?
So actually, this is a field that's been around for a long time, but we're finding there's a convergence of technologies which are sort of really allowing it to flourish. And it's very simply the idea that you imagine a sort of conventional battery. Sort of, you've either got the sort of the Duracell, if you think about personal components. They've been the same shape for eons.
Yeah.
And then sort of you've got sort of the battery in your car, same shape. I mean, it's just this block of stuff. stuff.
That's right. And if you live here in Arizona, you know because you replace it every year in your car.
That's right. So you see it.
You see it every year.
But then what the question here is, what if the structural components of something, say you take an airplane or a car, the things that actually form the body of it, what if those are also batteries?
Yeah.
So now you're no longer having that separate awkwardly shaped battery that you have to plonk into something, but everything is part of the function as well as the form.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to find that there are a combination of things sort of with new materials, new ways of being able to sort of construct batteries, new ways of actually being able to design sort of things, is allowing this ability to create these composite materials that actually have these battery functions built into them. And we're beginning to see this. I mean, if you look at the electric vehicles, Tesla have played around with this a little bit.
Yep.
There are some sort of airline companies that are beginning to play with this, but it feels like we're just at the beginning of a mind shift in how we think about incorporating batteries into products.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, again, I came to this, that was the first time I was like, number one? Well, first of all, I was always there was a brief moment where I thought, I was like, should we do this like the late night top 10 thing? And I was like, no, that's too crazy.
Right, yeah.
But I was, to be honest, I was surprised that this was one of the key pieces. And what was interesting, same thing. So you're going through it and you're like, okay, but I get that, you know, you got carbon fiber, you got the stuff, and you can think about, okay, so now we're fusing structure with energy.
Yes. Yeah.
And
of course,
capacity.
The big driver here is this move towards electrical systems.
Yeah.
Sort of as soon as we begin to electrify everything, you've got to work out how to deal with those batteries.
Well,
this changes it from a problem to a solution.
Well, and batteries have been, have long been one of the difficult problem with electronics is like we have more electronic consumption than we have ability to. I mean, you know this when you're like, my phone's dead, right? You know the pain of having that. But also, I thought was really interesting about this is a couple pieces. One is also what you could do. So, for example, an EV vehicle or like an airplane or helicopter, or those like personal electronic helicopter type, vertical take of eVTOLs or whatever they're called.
Yes,
is like when you can move the weight of that battery to the structure, you now are be able to I would imagine also because a challenge with EV vehicles, I feel like we need Jamie here to ask him about it too, but is like the weight that those batteries put,
very significant.
It changes the balance of the car. So crash testing in terms of where the weight of the car is.
Yes. Yep.
It also creates this concentrated issue of potentially especially with like lithium style batteries, the runaway like fire hazard and all this kind of stuff. But so that's compelling. But also I thought even more compelling was using this in more, because right away with vehicles, my first thought is, but what happens when you bend it or break it? So instead of just your front bumper crunching, now your battery
that's where
is
these
crunched.
Sophisticated composites come in. You can now begin to sort of have a holistic design process with how you build something that runs on electricity.
Yeah. But then I was thinking, one of the cool pieces to me, again, thinking about the future application of this is I'm like, solar panels on buildings and having then what do? You route those down to some big old battery wall inside of a garage or whatever. But it's like, but what if that material was part of the structure of the building itself?
There you are, yes.
And so now you have this ability, because there's also, I mean, not on this particular piece here, but in other sort of building technologies, this idea of a living building that can breathe with air and all this stuff, but the ability to have its structure be part and parcel with its energy system, I thought was incredibly cool as a way of...
Yeah. So, and this is what we do. It's the serendipitously unexpected. That you suddenly realize when you think about it, actually, this is pretty transformative.
This is really cool. Right. And you start thinking about all these new potentials that kind of spin off of that.
Yeah. So then that takes us to the second one, which again, I think is one that many people wouldn't have thought about. Osmotic Power Systems. So again, this is actually a technology that's been around for a long time. We just haven't had the ability to transform it into something that's practical. And it's very, very simply the idea of generating electricity if you've got one body of water with high salinity and one body of water with low salinity. You can put devices in between them. And that difference in salinity actually it creates a pressure differential, which you can then use to generate electricity. And we're just getting to the point where we can scale this up.
This is one of the ones for me that I thought was, again, a little surprising to see it, where you're like, Osmotic.
Where's the AI?
Well, I love where's the AI in this?
Yeah.
Come on, guys. But also, I mean, I love that the subtext of this one. Osmotic Power Systems, channeling salt into energy.
Yes.
It explains it. But I mean, so again, this is one of those examples of it's not a new technology. It's the new sort of resurgence in how it's being adopted, because it was apparently originally proposed in 1975.
Right. Yes.
But now has the technology sort of caught up in a way where it's now this feasible method, but also it's not a single way of doing it. There's multiple ways of doing this. One of building up pressure. So essentially this concept of just leveraging a natural system of the salinity of water and how water will move from different states, trying to balance out. And using that. So two different ways. One is to cause like a pressure buildup that then moves more traditional things you might think of it than pressures like a turbine to move and generate electricity. The other way of putting this membrane in that uses the actual movement of these charged ions past it. And I was like, that's big. Like, I'm like, I would need to dig into the science to get this metaphor. But I'm like, is that like static electricity in the water? Like you're like, is that kind of the same concept? Like you're rubbing these ions past a membrane, charges up the electrical.
There are electrons involved, so there's some connection there.
I'm like, that's how I'm thinking of it. Right. But I thought that was incredibly cool. But
but also it shows you that sometimes you may get cynical and think, there's nothing new in the world, but you just need to change your perspective just through 90 degrees and suddenly realize there's a whole wealth of new things we can do there.
Yeah. And again, thinking about the massive amount of power consumption needed, because I think this will also kind of dovetail us into number 3.
Yes.
But it's like, with the things that are missing from this list, right? All these massive super AI farms and stuff, the amount of energy consumption that has been increasingly rising. Suddenly you're like, aha, these are emergent technologies. These are solutions. And like these potentially are incredibly green solutions to meeting that. And it's like, and just the amount of salt water on this planet. I mean, it's what, 70% of the coverage of the planet.
Right. Yes. And actually, I think it was either last year or the year before we had green data, sort of looking at how do you sort of ensure sort of these big data centers are as green as possible in terms of the energy they use. So this now begins to fit into past emerging technologies.
Yeah. Maybe not putting them in the middle of a desert. Power centers. Let's put them underwater.
Well, we need other power sources for that, which actually brings us to number 3, which is
advanced nuclear technologies, bringing next generation nuclear power progress.
Yeah. So I would say here we tend to try and avoid these sort of big, broad categories because we like to get specific. But this is one we couldn't avoid simply because the renewed interest in different forms of nuclear power generation, including small modular reactors, which are a big thing.
And we've talked about these before. I think if I remember correctly too, I mean, these SMRs, what a cool name for like when you're like, it's a pocket reactor. And this is,
bit bigger than your pocket.
Well, compared to the container, the steam funnel, that we imagine with these things. But I think this. I think was broadly brought to a lot of people's attention with a lot of the Microsoft announcements back whenever that was earlier in the year when they were announcing that they were like, we need to spin up nuclear energy to power our data centers. But of course, and again, it's interesting to look globally because, looking around the world, how many different countries, for example, are using nuclear energy compared to the United States, because we actually don't use very much compared to countries in the EU, compared to Korea, South Korea, and things like that in terms of spinning up these new type of reactors. But it's really interesting because I would say a lot of Americans, the first thought off the bat is, of course, 3 Mile Island.
Right.
There's the Chernobyl, these incidents where you're like
a long history of events that have really sensitized a lot of people against using nuclear power. Although it also has to be said, and I think this is important when you're beginning to look at technologies like SMRs and others, nuclear power has changed dramatically in terms of how we actually construct these power plants and power sources, how we ensure safety, how we ensure there is very unlikely to be the sort of accidents that we've seen in the past.
And it was, so I'll just mention this so people can do a deeper dive, that there's these generation 3 and generation 4 of these sort of these reactors. So generation 3 is still water cooled, but it's using what is called accident tolerant fuels.
Okay.
So if there is, so basically they're created in such a way so the disasters like Chernobyl cannot happen.
Right. Yes.
Because if a disaster happens, the
it's
fuel
fail safe rather than fail in a really messy way.
Fail forward.
Right.
I don't know.
No.
Fail catastrophe. I don't know. But it is. So it's like one of these things where you're like, oh, well, once there's an accident, the fuel essentially becomes, I don't want to use the term inert, but it stops the reaction from taking place.
That's it. Yeah.
But interesting too. I mean, again, this is where some of the sci-fi bit sort of sneaks into your brain is in Generation 4 that you were using alternative cooling fuels like molten metals.
Yes.
Molten salt.
Yep.
Right? And probably I would have, and there's a mention of helium, which I don't think is probably molten, but it's probably just highly concentrated helium. But it's just this interesting way of like that. Wow, that's an interesting way. You're like a molten metal.
and sort of, we've had sort of similar cooling systems before, but it shows you that with some imagination and creativity, there are ways of harnessing power sources like this that we simply haven't played with in the past.
Yeah.
And now people are beginning to see new opportunities here at a time when we desperately need to think about where we get the power from that is going to fuel the future. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to note too. I mean, there's this like longer term goal, right? Of moving away, moving away from this idea of, fusion and moving towards fission.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Well, though fusion is an interesting one. So I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that in the committee, we have talked about fusion.
Okay.
Because there is exciting stuff happening around fusion.
Yeah.
But this is a great example of the methodology. So we're getting closer to having a functional sort of framework for fusion power, but we're not there yet. It's still experimental. And because of that, the decision was made that we cannot see a way that this is going to have full commercial and societal impact in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
So yes, fusion is incredibly exciting, but it's not there yet in terms of an emerging technology for this list.
And there's been some exciting outputs and stuff where they're yes, we've done it. And I think the best is we've made it, it's been like close to neutral in terms of energy loss, right? But I mean, that's one of the pieces here. I mean, I wrote a note here because it's even noted it's on page 16 of the report is even talking about, while this isn't right now, there's an expectation over the next couple of decades, next 10 to 20 years or so, that if we can get to a place where you get more energy out than it takes to put in, right, that you approach this. I mean, if we can crack that, right, you're essentially looking at almost limitless source of power. Right?
Yeah. Now, so an interesting story here.
I'm going to tap the physicist in here. Right?
Yeah. So things may have changed. So I remember back in the 1980s when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and we talked a lot about nuclear power, including fusion. In fact, Chernobyl happened while I was doing this degree.
Oh,
and to the credit of the degree program, we spent a lot of time talking about Chernobyl. But one of the things that came out of that was talking about fusion power.
Yeah.
And I remember back then a professor saying that you've got to get over this idea that fusion gives you limitless energy. It does if you just look at the physics of it. But when you look at all of the materials,
the pipeline,
the pipeline that allows you to translate that energy into something that's usable, there are materials there that absolutely are not limitless.
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily limited by the energy output, but you are limited by the materials necessary to actually, well, not the energy input, but the materials that are required to translate that nuclear energy into heat, into electricity.
Yeah.
I think things have changed since then. That was back in the 1980s, but still, you've got to think about the whole system, not just the power source.
Yeah. Well, and I know, I mean, just the last bit on this is just, I know, again, from a lot of the research that's currently undergoing, trying to do that is, again, you're trying to basically fuse hydrogen atoms to form helium.
Yeah.
And so, but the amount of, again, this happens in a star. Right. Like, and you're like, wow. And then like, we're trying to do, so if you think about the scale and energy of a star, and you're like, and we're trying to do that in some way, not in someone's garage, but maybe comparatively.
It is crazy hard.
How much energy is required just to try to force those two atoms together.
So the joke has been for the last goodness knows how many decades that fusion power is always about 30 years away. And it was
like flying cars.
It was 30 years away in the 80s when I was studying physics and going around sort of these big experimental systems. It's still 30 years away.
We should do an episode of all the tech that is still 30 years away. Right, there's a pretty good list.
Yeah. One day we'll crack it though.
One day, we'll get there. Yeah. All right.
So on to 4, yes, which is a change of pace.
Yes. Yeah. And this one also brought back a lot of recent conversations we had with our colleague like Emma, for example.
Very much so.
Number 4, engineered living therapeutics.
Yes.
Microbes designed to deliver therapies on demand.
Yes.
Okay, super cool. So we just went from small nuclear reactors in the back of your car to essentially injecting yourself with therapeutics that live in your body.
And of course, this is really exciting. And it gets to this idea of engineering microbes, engineering cells, so they can produce stuff which is useful, but not necessarily an inherent part of the cell. So there are so many different ideas here, but one idea is imagine that all of those microbes that you have in your probiotics who live in your gut, you can actually engineer them so as well as doing what they do, they generate sort of materials that are actually good for you.
Yeah.
Whether that's sort of vitamins, whether it's therapeutic agents, goodness knows what.
Yeah.
And so this is actually a very vibrant area of research, and we're getting closer to being able to do this.
Yep. When I'm reading through this, right? So it's this idea, I think again, this probiotic system, right? Which, I take these, I pop one of these almost every night,
But those haven't been engineered yet.
Right. And they're also not tailored to me, right? So, but this idea, right, of having that in there so that they can produce these like drugs.
Yes.
Right? Like, oh, do you need something?
Yep.
Hold on.
But also, in principle, you can switch it on and off.
Yeah,
so if you get it right,
enzymes, hormones, things, right? And all of these things. And this sort of triggers in my mind too, a lot of the talk around these epigenetic markers that we have and how, if we could figure out a therapeutic way of doing this to which could be tailored to the individual to turn things on or off. That can help, right? With whatever it is. Maybe it's staying away from something or trying to get something, using your own genetic code that's already there. And you're working on the things that lie above the genetic code in terms of what things that we can manipulate that. And then, of course, right off thinking about how cool would that be is you're like, wait a minute.
Is this such a good idea?
What if it decides it wants to grow something that doesn't?
What could possibly go wrong?
Go wrong.
Yeah.
And then, again, that's just a callback to that episode we had with Emma too about the idea of care with synthetic biology like this, is really this idea of, and right in the report too, it addresses right away that obviously safety is like the central focus here on the main concerns, because what are these unintended consequences of like genetic transfer? What about immune responses? Like if we could put these microbes in you, because there'd be a danger once it's in there, how would you get it out?
That's right. Yeah. If you suddenly get an allergic reaction or something.
Yeah. Now it's like, what is it? How long is the human intestines? 20 feet? Something like that?
I can't remember.
Or whatever, feet, however long it's like you've got 20 feet worth of painful.
Flushing all of that out is,
it's going to take some time.
Right.
And what if it doesn't want to leave?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But that said, there are so many really intriguing sort of applications for this. So I'll actually go back to one that feels very trivial. And actually, this goes back to synthetic biology. And this is many years ago. I'm trying to think, sort of 10, 15 years ago now. So I think we mentioned in the episode with Emma iGEM, the International Genetically Engineered Machine competition, where you have these groups of students get together to re-engineer microbes to do things.
Make cool stuff.
And several years ago, there was this conceptual idea, which I loved. And they actually had a couple of conceptual designers sort of work on this. But the idea was taking probiotics that released dyes according to the health of your body.
Oh, interesting.
So you could use this as an indicator of sickness, sort of early indicator of cancer, or you've got sort of XYZ disease.
These like biomarkers. So basically when you turn around to,
that's exactly it. It changes the color of your poop.
Yep.
But yes, you can sort of expand this out. But it's a very, very simple idea of microbes that have been engineered to, in this case, act as an early indicator of something that's going wrong.
Yeah.
But just as the way that these would release a dye, you can imagine they would release a therapeutic to actually correct the thing that's going on.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting too, because as funny, I'm too immature to ever talk about these things without having potty humor. But there's also this like, I feel like in many ways that this idea of evaluating what comes out of your body is in some ways taboo. Like we shouldn't talk about, but also, incredible health information that's coming out of you, like, and how many markers. And here's so this is a totally random thing that I risk debunking or taking this whole show off the rails. when we lived in Europe for a long time, we were exposed to shelf toilets.
Okay.
Do you know what these are? Have you seen these?
I'm not sure I have. Okay. I think I might know what you're talking about.
So I'll prep also because we were talking about Japanese toilets a while ago. In the US, for example, the common toilet has the bowl of water and then the drain sort of situated at the back. So it's basically just a bowl of water with a drain at the bottom.
Yep.
A shelf toilet has the drain at the very front and basically a literal shelf. Right? So the waste goes onto this shelf. And then when you flush the toilet, it's flushed off the shelf down the drain.
Yes.
But the point of it has a historical origin of inspecting your own waste for markers of sickness.
Because in the past, this was a thing that was done.
If you didn't have a doctor, you couldn't go like whatever. Like you would, I mean, not to get into it, but basically investigating that can give you tips on even just your dietary health in terms of hydration, all this stuff. But it was interesting because I was like, these shelf toilets, right? What is with these shelf toilets?
Strangely enough, this actually didn't reach the WEF report.
And now we know why Sean's never been invited.
Right.
Oh,
but
goodness.
we should move on because actually the next one is associated with this because again it's looking at therapeutics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is a really interesting one because it touches on a hot topic, but in a way that I think people won't expect. So number 5 is GLP-1s. So GLP-1s, if people sort of are following the news, these are the drugs behind the current spate of weight loss drugs. But more importantly, they were designed for working with diabetes because they help your body sort of manage the insulin and the glucose relationship. But it's a class of drugs where people are discovering that they seem to be able to do almost anything. So and number 5 here was GLPs, not for weight loss or not for diabetes treatment, but for degenerative disease. And talking about how there's evidence emerging that they activate brain pathways for longer, healthier lives.
This is wild.
And this was new to me. But it's just yet another thing that these drugs seem to be able to do in terms of actually helping your brain function better for longer.
I thought this was, and also this one I would put in that category of like, though the GLPs we've had, that's not the innovation. It's the application of it in ways that we didn't really know yet, or maybe you didn't even plan for.
Right. Yes.
And for, so GLPs, right, this glucagon like peptide. And again, the commercial thing, most people know it as Ozempic or
Manjaro. So personally, I'm on Manjaro for diabetes, not for anything else. So I'm reading this thinking,
you do look good, by the way.
But I'm reading this thinking, does this mean that my brain's going to be working better? I'm still waiting for this to happen, by the way.
At least it's not the opposite. At least that's usually what happens is you're like, new study finds the thing that you are on is now worse for you than you thought.
Yes.
But I think this is really, well, there's a couple of things for me that I react to this. One is this is possibly tremendously amazing to have this unintended discovery that this drug is also having potentially positive impact on things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's.
That's it,
right?
Yes.
These degenerative neurological diseases. But also it's wild that we're having this, but also again, how connected the human body is in all of these elements.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, so originally, how do we handle this insulin issue with diabetes and kind of work that and discovering that, hey, if you can fix some of those issues. Also, what are these other things that are potentially, and what this is not saying is that diabetes is directly associated with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's.
Not at all. No. This is a drug that seems to be having effects in systems that you wouldn't imagine.
Unknown ways. And again, from my perspective too, I'm like, how refreshing is it literally? Because I'm one of those people when I try to avoid taking medication unless I need to. And then you look at it and you're like, caution, may cause, and you're like, how many of these things are worse than the thing I'm taking it for in the first place?
Whereas this is caution, may improve your liver, may improve your brain, may improve your sort of pancreatic system, may improve,
And you get a little better looking while you're doing it, maybe. I don't know, but it was interesting. But, I think again, too, these are, I think the application here, the neurodegenerative thing, early days, but signs are the signals are increasing that this is something really to pay attention to.
We'll see whether there's another sort of craze and a run on these drugs.
Yeah.
Because this is obviously what's happened with weight loss.
Yeah.
I mean, for many cases, this is off-label, but people are desperate to get hold of them because they see the advantages. Interesting to see whether WEFA's actually started a new run on these.
Right. All of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute. Could we not have had this information long enough ago to buy stock or something? I don't know.
Yeah.
No, it's incredibly cool. I think this is going to be an interesting space to watch as well, because also, I mean, we're going to get now, just because, as you mentioned, the popularity of it for its original and unintended first side effect was weight loss. Right. But as a result of that, the massive adoption of it is also, we're having massive case studies now to watch what happens with this. So, I think this is one of those drugs in particular that we'll see. And again, I look at this and go, well, what other things might it do too? Because, I mean.
And actually, you look at the research, there's a whole raft of things where they're seeing effects. And again, we have to be a little careful because there's a big difference between a study that indicates an effect and a double-blind clinical trial that actually proves it.
Right, absolutely. But I mean, and again, and this, I would lump this in the category too of some of these unintended or unknown possibilities that have emerged. I mean, again, even going back to the work that was done with the COVID-19 vaccine, and seeing by using some of the technologies and tools to sort of rapidly develop this technique of those being applied to things like MS, like multiple sclerosis, right? So looking at like, can we, and I'm like, and that is again where you're like, wow, using these tools, and then you start to see these other massive health implications there. It could be just absolutely exciting.
Yeah, so that was an exciting one. And then
moving on.
6?
Sure, let's move on to number 6.
Yes.
Am I doing it? Should I do it? Okay.
You should do it.
Number 6, autonomous biochemical sensing. Wiring biological sensors for real-time insight. This was another one where I was like,
what is this? Yeah.
Well, and also like, this could go wrong.
I know. And of course, it feels like this connects to the previous one with microbes. But this is sort of now looking at the environment where you have these things out in the environment.
Yep, out there, and then continuously being able to, I was thinking about this too, right? Like you have, I'll even read this first bit here. Yeah. Autonomous biochemical sensors, because this one's a little hard to sort of unpack, are analytical devices that autonomously and continuously detect and quantify specific biochemical parameters. So such as disease markers in patient and individual health management, or chemical changes in soil or water for environmental management. So basically, I mean, think the way I was envisioning this, right, is like take just a sensor and make it essentially like microscopic and everywhere.
Right.
And that's almost like a hive mind that they're communicating. But that's you would have this real-time ability, as you were mentioning before, with like the gut thing even. But like putting this in your soil.
And I sort of preempted that with the gut because this is more in line with this one than the
but even still, but like you could see how these things would be working together.
Yes.
Right? Yep. Like, so the therapeutic is something that you're in there, and then this is what maybe they're creating is sensors to monitor these kind of things, right?
Yeah.
But this idea, and so, but not just, so if you think about it like this too, I was thinking, and I think they make a mention here to put it in perspective, a typical sensor, which you might not think of it as like a COVID-19 test. A lot of people have experience taking the at-home test and things like that. Yep. You're taking a single snapshot of is there a viral load? Is there this thing? And that can only tell you from that moment.
That's right.
What happened 5 minutes later, or whatever. But having this autonomous and continuous monitoring, you could think of. I had this thought where I'm like, so those mornings you wake up and you're like, God, I feel terrible, and you're like, was it because I didn't get enough sleep? Did I have too much to eat or drink? Did I catch something?
Yeah.
I just flew home from wherever. Did I catch a bug? Like in some future state, you might have this capability where you have things warning you, like, hey, we've detected, you've got rhinovirus in your body.
So I'm actually imagining it. This probably goes way beyond where the authors of this particular piece were. But there's been talk for years about interactive tattoos.
Oh, interactive tattoo. I thought you were going to go with the glucose monitoring.
No. That's simple stuff. No. I'm talking about the cool complex stuff where you have a tattoo which is actually a bunch of sensors and a dynamic display
that could reconfigure themselves.
That's right. So you now imagine it's got these biochemical sensors in that are measuring not only what's in your environment but also what's in your body and actually displaying it in real time. So you wake up in the morning feeling as if you've got a hangover even though you didn't go partying, and you look at it and say, yeah, this is what happened over the last 10 hours.
Oh, yeah, that could be really cool. Or
it could be a little revealing. I'm not quite sure where you put this.
Right. Or I just think it's like someone hacking it and being like, showing like, I knew you were full of it. Your arm tattoo said so.
Or just when your wife grabs hold of your arm and says, yeah, you know what you said about what you were doing last night.
Like, are you reading right now? Right. Like, no, I'm checking, I didn't think about that. That could be that's a really cool.
That is the spectrum.
And here I was going with like health things and
but it is really cool. And of course the thing that this pulls out is this is a convergent technology.
Yeah.
It is only possible to begin thinking about doing this in any practical way because of a convergence of biotech and nanotechnology. And they also mention things like biomimetics. How do we actually learn from how nature does things? And then bringing that into the technology.
Yeah, exactly. And then, again, what I love too about this report is, not only does it give you this tech, but it gives you that sort of realistic counterbalance of like, what are the challenges today? Right? I mean, short lifespans of sensors. How do we replace them? How do you do this? But yeah, it's a really fascinating space to be watching because I think that could be a really interesting. And again, I was talking about too, just like glucose monitoring. I mean, if you know someone who wears an on-body glucose monitor, these are. I mean, they've come a long way.
They're still a little bulky.
But they're still bulky. They're still painful. They're still you still have to deal with these things. And how nice would it be in a future where this is done safely, where you just have these things? Maybe I guess they need replacing. Maybe you swallow a pill every so often. I don't know. But this idea that you would have this continual evaluation of that, and also just so you can. I mean, even if you don't have diabetes. There's a tremendous amount of information of personal datification to understand like what happens to me if I eat this banana. Like, how does my body respond to that? Because you might notice, during the day, I mean, everyone talks about this. The afternoon slump. Well, what is that? Well, you're seeing these crashes in your body.
Maybe you can hack your system by actually gathering data.
Or understanding like how I respond to certain foods or certain things compared to whatever.
And of course, that's personal health. But then you sort of look at it in terms of population health and the environment. Because one of the things you can, in principle, do is if you've got these biochemical centers through the environment, you've now got a very easy means of seeing what the health of the environment is or a population. And this is, of course, what happened with COVID, where we looked at sort of monitoring sort of waste streams to see sort of where there were hotspots of COVID.
Giant shelf toilets for the whole city.
There we are. No. This is going to take a cultural shift, I feel.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's move on.
Yes. Number 7. So number 7 was an interesting one.
This one was cool.
Yeah. So green nitrogen fixation. That's not fixation on nitrogen. It's actually fixing nitrogen. Reimagining ammonia production for a net zero future.
Why do we care about making ammonia?
Because of fertilizers. So the really intriguing thing here is you look at the world at the moment, 8 billion people, and the only way the world can sustain as many people as this is because we have artificial fertilizers that allow us to grow the sort of crops that we need. Without the green revolution of the past and artificial fertilizers, we would not be able to do this.
Yeah.
But it is hard. And it is not particularly sustainable. How we actually sort of fix nitrogen into ammonia and ways that we can actually sort of use it as a fertilizer and use it productively. Yeah. I'm struggling with words this week. So now this is beginning to look at new technologies that allow us to take the nitrogen in the atmosphere, which is incredibly sort of available. There's a lot of it there.
Yeah.
But then sort of transform it into
most of our atmosphere. It's most of our breathable air.
Most of our breathable
71%,
yes.
Something like that.
But this is looking at emerging technologies that allow us to take that and convert it into a form that we can actually use productively to actually grow stuff.
Yeah, no, that's wild. I mean, I jotted down some notes right off the report, which I didn't realize that this industry of nitrogen fixation is a $200 billion market in the U.S. alone.
Right.
Not worldwide, just the U.S.
And so just on that point, and this is something...
$200 billion.
So many people forget this, that when we're talking about emerging and transformative technologies, it's almost always the things that you've never heard of that have the biggest impact.
Yeah. And to put it in perspective, right, that market is creating something on the scale, it says here, 150 million tons per year of ammonia, which is used to produce roughly 50% of the world's food production. 50%.
Yeah.
So when it's like, again, so when my first question of like, who needs this ammonia? It's like, yeah, we will starve without it.
That's exactly it.
50% at present. Right. And so, yeah, like being able to do this in a way that makes it more sustainable, less energy, all the removing the friction from the fixation. Finally.
How long did it take you to come up with that one?
Longer than I'd care to ever admit. But no, I think that's one of those things that's incredible. And again, one of the things, when you read this, for me, I'm like, I'd much rather hear about this than AI. Right? Like this is where you're like, yes, because
this is where the rubber hits the road.
And again, coming back to this idea, right? This is where you have that you're setting up action. Right. So it's not just, there's this sexy new thing and how cool, and we can all pretend like, wow. It's like, no, this is a real thing impacting 50% of the world's food population or production. And now, like, how do we move this forward, and how do we move this from idea to action to market? And because out of this list too, you're like, well, that one might be in terms of immediate benefit to humans. You're like, pin that to the top.
Right. Yeah.
Crazy.
And which is a good place to say that this really isn't an order of priority. Sort of the number one wasn't the most important one.
That's true.
Possibly the last one is because I had a hand in writing.
We'll save that. I'll drum roll for that one. We'll do that.
Right.
We'll drum roll.
But on to number 8.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, nanozymes, replicating nature's catalysts for health and environmental breakthroughs. So nanozymes.
We know what enzymes are.
Yeah. So nanozymes are this idea of creating artificial enzymes using nanotechnology. So yes, an enzyme, of course, is a biological molecule that catalyzes reactions. Incredibly important in biology for allowing things to happen without it costing too much energy or ways of getting over energy barriers. So all of biology runs on enzymes. But for a long time, people have thought, because enzymes are really complex, can we actually manufacture artificial enzymes using nanotechnology? And it has to be nanotechnology because biology works at a nanoscale with molecules. And we're now getting to the point where we can begin to design and engineer these nanoscale enzymes, these nanozymes. So the story behind here, and so this is a little bit sort of unveiling sort of the process behind the scenes.
Sure.
Because this was really pushed and proposed by a good friend of mine, Javier Garcia Martinez, who wrote this up. And Javier has been pushing these for years.
He's been on his agenda.
And every year we look at this and think, nanozymes, is this really a thing? And then this year, I actually decided to do a deep dive. And actually, this is where AI comes in. In the meeting, I was sort of asking ChatGPT deep research, is there anything in these nanozymes thing? And it comes back with this report saying, yeah, this is a really big business.
Nice.
So and it wasn't necessarily this that flipped it, but I think it certainly made me realize that something that I thought was still sort of in a sparkle in the eye of nanotechnology researchers actually is something that is maturing and going to be really impactful.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. And again, it's interesting because I feel like there's a thread here of a few of these that you could kind of cluster together that are all under this synthetic biology, synthetic space too. And again, I will call back to I forget which episode number it was, but it's one of those Emma where we talk about synthetic biology because so much of what the future development of these, I think, hinges dramatically on what we were talking about in terms of this idea of care behind this as well. Which, I mean, again, this is one of the things that having these things were not connected. And I loved reading in the report, again, even just as the WEF report surfaces and highlights these challenges, right? That as with all of these things, that there's a lot of challenges in terms of the ethical considerations of how these would be created and used, understanding how they would work safely through evaluations and in the environment. And that it's not this this is the new technology and we should just go forward at all costs because there's a potential market or economic incentive.
Right. And the reality is that enzymes or nanozymes, catalysts are incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And so just to reiterate this, and this is not necessarily just in biological systems, it's any system where you're trying to create stuff. So the problem with the biological and chemical world is you can have one bunch of chemicals that represent a certain amount of energy. You've got a product that you want to make from them, which represents a similar level of energy. But to get from A to B, you've got to get over this massive energy bump. It's like sort of in conventional sense, sort of you're sort of sitting on one side of the Himalayas and you want to get to the other side.
Just a matter of going over that.
They're both on the same level, both on sea level. But to get from A to B, you've got to have this massive trek, which takes up so much energy. It's not worthwhile. But the enzymes effectively allow you to tunnel underneath and get from A to B incredibly simply. Yeah. So this is the only reason that biology works. And this is how heterogeneous catalysts work within sort of material science. But if we can take the secret source of enzymes and manufacture them, we can effectively create these shortcuts between the sort of the base materials of what we're trying to make and the final products.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly exciting. Yes. I mean, again, with knowing that on that side of that is all of the things that need to happen to make sure that it goes according to plan.
That's right, because the problem is if it's really easy for these chemical reactions to take place, sort of what happens that you don't want to happen?
I mean, how does this?
Because, of course, when you think about sort of powerful chemical reactions, this is what happens in a bomb.
Yeah.
And we're back to nuclear power.
There we go. Go ahead and put some of that right in the old veins there. We'll, I forget which, I think it was a Iron Man movie where they would go around and they would like become like human bombs because they would change their, and I'm like, yeah, we don't need that.
No.
That would be,
this is not what nanozymes
that would be considered a negative outcome. Right. Well, at least you hope. Right.
Yes.
All right, let's move on to number 9.
Which is?
Number 9 is collaborative sensing. So not the biological sensing.
Yes.
Empowering connected systems to make context-aware decisions.
Yeah.
And this is one I thought was awesome because this is something I think even on our show we've touched on it from here and there when we were talking about like autonomous vehicles and things. But essentially, think about it. It can be described as this, sensing devices being somewhat ubiquitous in people's. So they're everywhere: homes, vehicles, workplace, maybe even yourself in some ways. That they're now become essentially a distributed mesh network of sensors, allowing things to talk to one another.
Yes.
So, I got excited about this because I believe I had mentioned this when we were talking about like the Waymos and the autonomous vehicles.
Yes.
Is the next evolution of that is these cars have a way of sensing the world around them.
Yep.
But what if the world around them can sense them and then they can communicate?
That's right. Yes. Yep.
Right. So not only can the cars potentially talk to one another, but they can talk to the traffic lights. They can talk to the buildings. They can talk to the curbs. The road itself may be able to communicate about.
It becomes a fully integrated system.
Yeah. Yes. And so now you can start to imagine there is what it is built is essentially this invisible layer of information that is the mesh network of this environment so that things can autonomously operate within there, but also you can get live real-time feedback of there's a disruption or there's an issue or there's or an opportunity. I mean, think even just parking, right?
Right.
You're like,
the
street's telling me there's 3 parts, but that's sweet, man. But yeah.
So and I know they use the example of vehicles and transportation systems here, but this goes much wider than this. And again, it's an idea that's been around for a long time, but it's only now that the technologies and the way we think about networks are beginning to make it viable. But you can see how transformative it is. So you think about humans at a human scale.
Yeah.
We actually, if you just look at a human-only group, so forget about the technology, those groups work in a really dynamic way because people are constantly seeing what's happening around them.
Yeah.
Everybody's seeing that. Everybody's constantly adjusting to the environment, which is where you can have a crowd of 100 or 1,000 people, and miraculously, they all seem to sort of be able to move between each other and get to where they're going. But you put that in the context of an incredibly complex technological world, which is now not mediated by humans and by eyesight and by touch and feel and walking. It's mediated by machines. If those machines aren't connected in the same way, you can have chaos. So this is where you get incredible sort of traffic jams and backups. It's where systems fail.
Horrible accidents where things happen.
That's right. But imagine if everything can talk to each other in the right language. You can reduce the friction and ease the flow, which is where when you come to sort of looking at autonomous systems, and this is something that with vehicles, this is something that always amazes me. So you look at the speed of getting from A to B in a car.
Yep.
It is limited by the technologies we have with traffic lights, with traffic flow systems, with humans behind the wheel. If you had an interconnected system, you could speed things up massively, unbelievably massively in terms of getting from A to B.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if you ever have been sitting on a highway in a backed up traffic jam, you're like, well, if we all knew what was happening at the same time, even if there was an issue.
This is what happens in a disconnected system.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or if you've ever had to merge with people who don't understand how to zipper merge, and it's like, oh my.
We're not even going to go there because I do not have the permission living in America to talk about people's lack of ability on roads.
I do. And I will say, I live this nightmare daily. But no, I mean, it's credible. I will say though, on the other side, so two things that came to my mind instantly when reading about this particular tech. One is a challenge from just the technological side. I remember our conversation with Bruno was talking about the sensors in autonomous vehicles and things, and how we are like, sensors everywhere. We've got high-tech cameras and this there and this there. And the reality of even just in the automotive industry of how slow and how limited the technology has been so far. What was it? Like state-of-the-art cameras in your cars is like a 1 megapixel camera. And you're like, what are you talking about? We've got gazillions of megapixels in our phones. But in those auto industries, that is not a simple thing of putting
that's it. It's you're fiendishly complex. Yes.
Yeah, and then suddenly then you're like, well, then we have to put those kind of sensors in the telephone pole, suddenly you're like, this is a big scale issue.
It is a huge scale issue and a huge interconnectivity issue, and even the theories behind that connectivity. And of course, it also raises questions around autonomy. Do you really want to feel as if everything is being monitored?
That was the other piece.
Until you think about that one case where you're coming onto a main road and you're sitting at the traffic lights and there's nothing else around, and those traffic lights refuse to change from red to green. And you're sitting there thinking, if only there was a smart network of sensors here that would realize I'm the only car here and would let me through.
Right. It wasn't just preset by somebody who's like, every 48 seconds, click, and then you walk away.
It usually feels like 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's very true. No, well, I think that's really, it was that piece. And then the other side of that too is also, if everything is constantly monitoring and aware, then you also raise the question of privacy.
Huge issues.
So if you are engaged in this mesh network, that would also theoretically, there'd be no privacy of how you move about in that network.
And here is the really big concern here. And I love this technology, but I'm also very cognizant of the downsides. Yep. And that is how, especially with artificial intelligence, you can form patterns from little snippets of data that give you an incredibly accurate profile of who somebody is, what they're doing, where they're going, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Yep. So you might think sitting at that intersection with a sensor there sort of identifying the car, you think, what's the big deal? Nobody's going to know anything from me. But you have a million little bits of information like that, and an AI can then begin to patch everything together to reveal things about you that probably you don't even
absolutely know. I mean, even in modern to even historic times, I mean, you've asked the question, well, what harm could come of people doing that? It's like, oh, well, suddenly it's no longer okay with us that these people go to that location. So now we know who those, we'll round them all up because now we know. I mean, so there's massive privacy challenge. And of course, in thinking from a US-centric perspective too, I mean, instantly massive concerns about the proprietary nature of this. Like, well, who's controlling it? Where's the policy? Where's the regulation? How is our data? How is the information used? Because we'll talk about another data information gold mine.
Right.
I mean, people are, they're paying a lot of money to grab your data offline anyway. How much would they pay to know your exact whereabouts and what you do, right?
So it's a great example of a potentially transformative technology, which we cannot even begin to grapple with until we begin to grapple with the social ramifications of it and how to actually develop it in socially responsive and responsible ways.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Okay, which actually is a nice segue into number 10.
All right, drum roll. One.
Okay, so number 10 is generative watermarking, enhancing trust with invisible, immutable markers. So this does get to artificial intelligence. And
finally!
And it grapples with the question of how do you know whether something is created by AI or not?
Yep.
And I've got to tell you, so I ended up spending a lot of time on this one, and I was initially very skeptical because I'd spent a lot of time thinking about AI and working on it. And I am not entirely sure that you can watermark stuff.
Yep.
And certainly when you're looking at text, the current wisdom is you simply cannot apply a test to a piece of text and say whether it was created by a human or an AI, because you're going to get it wrong. There are going to be some humans that write
the false
like
positives are incredible.
Those people in the world that use the word delve a lot. so I went
now
into
M
this,
dashes,
right? I went into this with some skepticism, but it turns out that there are some very, very sophisticated technologies that are being developed that do begin to allow things to be identified as AI versus not AI, whether those are text, whether those are images, whether they're video, whether they're audio. And of course, the driver here is that we are living in a world where AI is becoming so good at replicating what humans do that we're almost being pushed to an existential crisis where, unless you're sitting in front of somebody like you and I are, you cannot tell whether you're talking to a real person.
Even live, right? Like live video.
Live video, yes. Who knows whether it's AI or real? And so there's a growing feeling that there's got to be some way of differentiating. And there are some very, very clever technologies that are already being deployed. So if you just look at text, this idea of dropping in certain words and certain patterns of words that aren't obvious to a human reading it, but a machine looking at this can identify the patterns. So the word delve is an obvious one.
Right.
It's a tell.
Yeah.
But now imagine that there are a lot of these words, and they only become apparent when you read a paragraph and you see not only the different words that are used, but the spacing between them, the order that they're in, a whole bunch of things. So you can begin to see how you can begin to embed these watermarks into AI generated stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. When I read this too, I'm like, okay, I get it. Also, I think this technology in itself is a technological reaction to the technology, which always ruffles me the wrong way. Because I know this is sort of the
technological fix.
Yeah, it's the counterbalance to this. We have to do something about this, right? You can't just have anybody, because exactly. I mean, even from a video perspective, the area of like deep fakes, for example. I mean, these could be incredibly powerful. There's been even in the last like year or two, really serious examples of Zoom calls with someone pretending to be like a CEO for a company, getting someone to issue a massive check because they were like, that's my boss. That everything about this person, it sounds like them, looks like them, and they're asking me to do something that is what they would ask me to do. Not knowing that they've just been catfished basically by someone who wasn't there. But that triggers that reaction for me. But also is this idea of like, for me, I'm like, I can appreciate the technological application of that, of figuring out a way to create some kind of watermark system. However, even like looking historically, those never work because it's what this is a cat and mouse arms race.
See, that's
of
right.
Like,
you develop one technology and somebody works out.
I mean, right away, right? I could probably vibe code something where you're like, let's say it's Claude. Claude is putting delve every like ninth word and putting in 2 spaces instead of 1. I'm like, figure out what that thing is and make it look like that.
See that,
or
that's
reverse it, or
and of
whatever.
Course, if you're smart, you run text through the thing multiple times. And I think that this attests to the reality that, yes, we are going to find technological fixes and they're going to be important in some cases, but this is ultimately a social challenge.
It's a human problem.
That's exactly it. Yes.
And that's the thing. I mean, and that's one of those components. Because again, when you think about, here's an image and how do you bake in there the watermark that it was created by AI? I'm like, take a screenshot of it.
Right.
Okay, done. All right, next. So and again,
there are always going to be hacks to the system.
There are always going to be hacks to the system.
But I would say, and I think this is the same of any system, but you can also imagine sort of a future where you have standards. So sort of good players here actually adhere to standards. So 80% of the stuff that you see, you can actually tell whether it's AI or not. The difficulty is those people working at the fringes that work out how to get around this. Yeah.
And speaking of that, I will call out again, just something that I really appreciated from the World Economic Forum report here is, with each of the top 10, there are beautiful images that sort of go with the headings.
They are.
And what I appreciate, speaking of the transparency, is on the call out for each one of those is the image, what it is the credit that it was created. I think I looked at most of them. I think all of them were created in some form with Midjourney.
Right.
But they even give a abbreviated version of the prompt was there. Yes. So not only, and I just really appreciated that because it would be very easy to just not say anything.
That's it.
Or just say, or at most just say image created by Midjourney. But they even go the step. That wasn't a requirement. That's not. I mean, that was just going above and beyond.
And I would say
that transparency.
The images are beautiful. They're actually a wonderful demonstration of what you can do if you've got a designer mind working with AI.
Yeah. I mean, they're beautiful images. And I mean, I haven't done it yet, but I look at some of these, I'm like, I want to go try to create something like that. Because even starting from that prompt to see like, how long would it take me to sort of, strategically get one of these guys to work? But no, top 10.
Top 10, yes.
There we have it.
That was a long podcast, but really important, I think.
Very important, yeah. And the nice thing too about doing it this way is we can chunk it up also. I was thinking about that too. We'll release this obviously as one.
Yes. But then we can sort of come back to these.
Yeah.
But I would highly recommend people check out the report. You can either Google it or we'll put the link
absolutely.
in the show notes. Because I think it's incredibly revealing, as we've seen on multiple levels in terms of how we need to think about emerging technologies, how we need to think about impact, how we need to think about sort of the questions we should be asking about what we do and don't do. And how we look beyond and below the hype to what is really happening.
That's it. I mean, I think that I mean, if nothing, right, taking away from this is that it's sort of peeling the hype away from these technologies, or just looking through the clutter of, again, this AI dominated landscape at the moment. But also, I'll come back to this sort of plug that right on. Let's see, what is this? This is page 4. So right in the very front of the report, this note about building strategic foresight. So what do you do with these tools?
Yes.
And I think this is an important, it's just a one-page element that's in there, but it goes through and starts to give the reader sort of an executive summary of like, these technologies are emerging. We need to pay attention to them. But what do? We take things as assumptions. We take things as uncertainties and enablers. What do we do with this information?
Right. Yes.
And I think that's going to be key, because whether it's these 10 or wait 6 more months and there'll be another group of things, as this thing, doesn't wait for the report. Sadly, there could be a thing the next day that's like, oh, that would have been in, and maybe it'll be in next year's. But this is a continuously moving space. But again, is not to get overwhelmed with the speed of innovation and disruption and convergence, but thinking about how do we prepare for this continuous uncertainty that these things bring, and what do we do with them? What do we do with this information? I think that's one of the most important things about that you can take away from this report.
I agree. Thank you.
So fantastic. Well, I say we'll put this one to bed.
we wrap up because this has been a long podcast.
It's been a long one, and I think we both deserve a rest. I think after this.
I agree. Yes.
But Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
Tremendous, and also tremendous to have somebody who was influential and embedded in this entire process to this podcast. You heard it here first. I think we can claim that.
Right.
I hope so. Anyway. But yeah, so I will stuff as much of the information as I can in the show notes, and obviously the key there is where to get this report.
Yes.
And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Modem Futura.
We'll see you then.
Demodulating signal.
Modem Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.